Hello everyone, I'm here to tell you some scary stories, but in a way that helps you relax and fall asleep. If you enjoy these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps a lot. Also, tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it right now. Now take a deep breath, listen to the gentle sound of the rain, and let your mind drift into the dark, peaceful world of tonight's story. The snow had been falling since dawn. Not the soft, picturesque kind that settled gently over rooftops, but a relentless, wind-driven torrent that devoured sound and swallowed the world whole. By nightfall, the town lay buried beneath a white silence so complete that it felt almost sacred, or cursed. Roads were sealed, curfews were announced, and even the power lines moaned under the weight of ice. Somewhere in that frozen quiet, Vladimir shoveled snow until his shoulders screamed, and his breath came out in ragged clouds. By the time he dragged himself inside, every muscle in his body was leaden. The heat from the furnace hummed through the walls, dry and constant, and the smell of reheated stew hung in the air. He ate without tasting, half watching the wind batter the window. Then, in search of comfort, he turned on an old copy of Star Trek. The glow of the television painted the living room in soft blues and grays, and as the captain's voice filled the room, the world outside seemed to fade to nothing. He didn't remember falling asleep, only the faint ache in his limbs, the hum of the furnace, the drone of the television slipping into static. When he woke, the house was darker. The screen had gone black, save for a faint square of reflection that mirrored the room's emptiness. His mouth was dry, and for a moment, he couldn't tell what had pulled him from sleep, only that something had. A noise, a small one but sharp enough to thread through the quiet. A faint rattle. Vladimir sat up slowly. The digital clock beside the couch blinked 1:04 a.m. in dim red light. The rattle came again, distant but distinct. Clink, 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 like metal against wood, muffled through a wall. The house creaked under the weight of snow, but this sound didn't belong to the house. It was deliberate, rhythmic, intentional. He held his breath, listening. The furnace clicked off, and for a heartbeat, the world stopped breathing with him. That was when he heard it, faint, cracked, and impossibly human. A whisper. Vladimir! The voice slid through the dark like a thread of cold air, barely audible, and yet his name hung in it. He froze. The whisper came again, more strained this time, a rasp struggling against silence. Vladimir! Punin! He turned toward the sound. His parents' room. The door down the hall. Every instinct told him to stay put, to rationalize it as the house settling, or maybe the wind sneaking through a cracked window. But the human mind has a cruel curiosity, the kind that whispers, what if it isn't the wind? For 10 long minutes, the noise persisted, the rattle, the whisper, both growing weaker, more desperate. Something inside him, fear, guilt, or some old reflex from childhood, pushed him to move. He reached for the small folding knife on the coffee table, a pitiful thing he used to open packages, and flicked it open with trembling fingers. The click of the blade felt absurdly loud. He hesitated, eyes locked on the dark hallway, the one that seemed longer than it should have been tonight. When he finally stood, the air felt different, thicker, like the house was holding its breath. The floorboards groaned under his steps as he crept forward, every sound amplified by silence. The door to his parents' room was ajar. Not enough to see inside, just enough to leak darkness into the hall. He pressed his hand to the wood. It was cold, as though the heat hadn't touched this part of the house in hours. The rattling had stopped. Only that faint whisper remained, hoarse, broken syllables dissolving into the air. He pushed the door open. Darkness poured out. At first, he could see nothing. His pupils clawed for light, but the room seemed impossibly black, as if something had swallowed all reflection. He stepped inside slowly, his knife trembling in his hand. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old coins or blood, Dad. His voice cracked the stillness like a stone through glass. No answer. He took another step. The carpet muffled his movement. The whispering had stopped. Then something brushed against his ankle. He jerked back, heart slamming into his throat. The knife nearly slipped from his hand. Something was there. A shape on the floor, shifting, clawing faintly toward him. A hand pale against the dark, then the whisper again, broken and small. "Help me." His father's voice. Vladimir's body went cold. The knife fell useless to his side as he dropped to his knees. His father's face was barely visible in the gloom, eyes wide open but unfocused, his right side slack. He was lying half in the doorway to the bathroom, his foot wedged against the door, the same foot that had been kicking, rattling, calling for help through the night. "Dad, oh my God!" He scrambled for the light switch, fingers numb and shaking. The bulb flickered once before coming alive, flooding the room with a sickly yellow glow. And for the first time, Vladimir saw the full horror of what had been whispering to him from the dark. The ambulance sirens were muffled by the storm, a low wail that seemed to come from beneath the snow itself. The wind had not stopped. It had grown sharper, cutting into every corner of the house like shards of glass. Vladimir followed the paramedics through the hallways, every movement feeling unreal, slowed, as if the world itself had been dipped in some viscous liquid. The snowstorm pressed against the windows, a white blur that erased the line between outside and inside. And inside, the air smelled of antiseptic, iron, and fear. He couldn't shake the image of his father's pale hand brushing against his ankle, the whisper that had pierced the darkness. "Help me." It haunted him. Not just in memory, but physically. A phantom vibration under his skin, a low hum behind his eyes like electricity coursing through his nervous system. The paramedics moved with a quiet efficiency, one asking questions he barely heard. The other placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding but not enough. Vladimir's mind raced ahead to the hospital, to the doctors' faces, the machines, the words that had started to feel inevitable. Then the whisper returned, not from his father. He was already in the gurney taken away, but from the house itself. Low, faint, almost beneath perception. He froze mid-step. "Vladimir." It was his name again, stretched thin like the wind, carried under the groan of the old floorboards. He spun around. The hallway was empty. No one. Only the darkness pooling in corners, the shadows of furniture twisted and alien in the ambulance's flashing lights. He shook his head. "It's just nerves. It's just the storm, the adrenaline." But the hair on his neck refused to lie. Even as he followed the stretcher out into the blizzard, he felt eyes, not human, on him. At the window, or just beyond it. Something there watching, something waiting. And yet when he turned, only the snow fell. The hospital was a nightmare of cold lights and antiseptic. Machines beeped in rhythm with his own heartbeat, or perhaps slightly ahead, mocking him. Doctors moved quickly, speaking in clipped professional sentences that blurred together. His father's prognosis was grim. Hemorrhagic stroke, massive bleeding, little hope without surgery. And still, in the corner of his vision, the shadows of the hospital hallways seemed to stretch farther than they should. That night, Vladimir could not sleep. He wandered the empty corridors, pulled toward the window where the snow still fell like ash from a dead sky. And then he heard it. Faint, soft, almost like static on a radio. The whispering again, calling him, beckoning him. He followed it. Not consciously, not with reason, but as if some invisible tether pulled him down a hallway no one else was walking. He pressed against walls, his breath fogging in the cold drafts. And at every turn the whispering grew stronger. Not his father this time, not human, but something else. Something impatient. He found himself outside the ICU, staring through a frosted glass window at his father's bed. Machines hummed, tubes, wires, screens flashing vital signs. But between the beeping he thought he saw it. A shadow moving behind the monitors, crouching, watching. Every time he blinked it disappeared, replaced by the sterile hospital light. And yet he knew it was there, waiting. Vladimir stumbled back to the waiting room, gripping his hands together so tightly that his knuckles bled through the skin. His chest burned, and the whisper followed him still, echoing through the ventilation, bouncing off walls, threading through his thoughts. "Help me," it said over and over, but not in his father's voice. A voice older, stranger, hollow. Hours passed. Time became meaningless. He could not tell if the storm outside was slowing or the world inside had simply unraveled. Every creak of the building made him jump. Every shadow seemed to twitch in rhythm with his heartbeat. And then the doctor emerged, grim-faced. But against all odds, there was survival. His father had made it through the surgery, cognitively intact, though paralyzed on the right side. Infection after infection, but still alive. Relief should have washed over him. Instead, the whispering intensified. Not from his father, who lay sleeping, exhausted, recovering. From the hospital itself, or from something bound to that night. The static between heartbeats, the flickering lights, the low hum under the floors. It seemed to follow him home, persistent like a warning, or a tether to some other presence that had been near the door that night. When Vladimir finally returned home, the house was silent. The snowstorm had passed, leaving a white world pristine and empty. But inside, the faint rattling lingered in his mind, like a memory he could not shake. And sometimes at night, when the world was still and his father slept, he thought he could hear it. Vladimir. The snow outside had finally stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a blinding, almost sterile quiet. Streets glistened with ice, trees sagged under the weight of frozen snow, and the occasional drip of melting icicles was the only sound. Yet inside Vladimir's home, silence had become something heavier, oppressive, thick enough to suffocate thought. He had returned from the hospital that evening, exhausted but relieved. His father was asleep on the couch, his right side rigid yet breathing steadily. His mother hovered nearby, tired and pale, her eyes betraying weeks of worry and sleepless nights. Everything should have felt normal. Everything should have felt safe. But the house had changed. In the kitchen, the floorboards groaned unnaturally under his weight. Shadows stretched and shifted across the walls even though the lights were on. He shook his head, blaming fatigue, his mind still tethered to the surreal night at the hospital. And then came the first whisper of the evening. Vladimir. Soft, coaxing, impossibly close, yet coming from nowhere. His pulse shot up. He gripped the edge of the countertop, staring into the hallway that led to his parents' room. The shadows there seemed deeper, darker, as though the walls themselves had absorbed some malevolent presence. He forced himself to take a step forward. His feet barely made a sound, but every creak of the floor seemed magnified. The whisper came again, carrying a subtle urgency this time, a quiet insistence. Vladimir, come. The knife he had used that night remained in the drawer, untouched, yet somehow he felt its absence, not its weight, but its protection. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Every instinct screamed to run, but curiosity, that ancient, foolish human trait, held him rooted. In the hallway, the shadows moved of their own accord. Not the normal flicker caused by lights, but deliberate, almost sentient. At first, he thought it was a trick of his eyes or a lingering hallucination born from exhaustion and fear. But then he saw it. A figure, indistinct, crouched in the corner near the bathroom doorway. It was human-shaped, but impossibly elongated, limbs stretching at odd angles, its head tilting unnaturally. He blinked. It vanished, and yet the whisper persisted. Vladimir! A cold draft brushed his face. His father's room was silent, dark, but the shadows in the hall seemed to thicken, pooling toward him, almost breathing. Something in the air carried a faint metallic scent, like the copper tang of blood, faint but unmistakable. He forced himself to look around. Nothing, just walls, furniture, and the ordinary trappings of home. But the feeling lingered, that some intelligence, some consciousness was there, just beyond perception, watching, waiting. For the next few nights, the whispers became routine. They were never loud enough to be fully comprehensible, always just out of reach, curling around his thoughts. At first, he tried to ignore them. Sleep became shallow, filled with nightmares of shadows that twisted and reached for him. Even in the light of day, corners of his house seemed darker, the walls subtly bending, elongating. He began to notice patterns. The whispers only came when the house was empty of other human presence. The shadows often congregated near doors, particularly his parents' room and the hallway bathroom. Sometimes he would catch a fleeting glimpse of movement in the mirror, a shape crossing the room behind him, gone the moment he turned. At night, the rattling returned. Not like the first time, frantic and pleading, but slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, like something testing the boundaries of the physical world, dragging itself along the floor, brushing against walls. Vladimir's father remained silent through all of it. Conscious, cognitively intact, yet somehow oblivious to the subtle distortions in reality. It was as if the presence respected him, or perhaps was tethered solely to Vladimir. One evening, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, Vladimir set up a small digital recorder in the hallway outside his parents' room. He left it on while he went to sleep in the living room. intending to capture the whispers and the faint rattling. When he played it back the next morning, the recording was a static-filled, distorted loop of sounds, creaks, whispers, footfalls, but interspersed were syllables he could not recognize, words not in any language he knew, and beneath it all, faint but clear, his own voice calling, "Tata Vladimir." Come. Vladimir felt his stomach churn. The house was no longer just a house. It was alive, attentive, patient, and something or someone wanted him to follow. Days passed, though Vladimir could no longer trust the concept of time. The snow outside had melted into grey slush, streets reopening, neighbors emerging cautiously into the cold light of winter. Yet inside, the house refused to conform to ordinary hours. Nights felt endless, and daylight brought only a fragile illusion of normalcy. Vladimir became obsessed with the hallway outside his parents' room. Every creak of the floor, every shadow, every subtle vibration of air made him tense. He knew that the presence lingered there, patient, waiting for him to make a mistake, to look away, to hesitate. And then the door began to act strangely. At first it was subtle, slightly off its hinges, a whisper of movement in the frame when no one touched it. Then more pronounced, a faint rattling, slow and deliberate. Not like before, frantic, soul but measured, ceremonial, like a heartbeat echoing through the hallway. Vladimir tried to rationalize it. Wood expanding in cold air, drafts, fatigue playing tricks on him, but logic faltered the moment he pressed his ear to the door and heard a single unmistakable whisper. "Vladimir!" He stumbled backward, breath rattling in his chest. The sound was inside the wood now, inside the house itself, not just coming through it. He pressed a hand to the door, half expecting it to be warm, pulsing, alive. It wasn't. But the pull, the magnetic insistence was undeniable. Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the door creaked, rattled, whispered. Sometimes it called his name even when the house was full of his parents, fully awake and present. The presence didn't care for them. It sought him. One night, desperate, he left the door ajar, knife in hand, sitting in the living room. Hours passed in silence, or so he thought. Then came a faint tap like fingernails on wood, rhythmic and slow. He approached cautiously. As he neared, the air grew colder, heavier, almost wet, and then he saw it. Not fully, only a flicker in the corner of his vision, but unmistakable. A shadow, elongated, crouching low, hunched as if pressed against the floor, its head tilted unnaturally, eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. It seemed to ripple in and out of visibility, as though the house itself had warped to allow its presence. The door rattled once more. The shadow moved in perfect synchronization, and then the whisper, closer than ever. "Vladimir, come!" He recoiled. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet part of him, something primal drawn to the unknown, wanted to step closer. The knife felt useless, his body frozen by the impossible intelligence in the room. For hours he watched, waiting, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to leave. Time became meaningless, light and shadow blurred. He realized with a sinking clarity that the house was no longer just a home. It was a living trap. And the door, that one door, the one his father had been rattling that night, was its heart. The presence seemed patient, but Vladimir knew patience could stretch into eternity. The whispers, the shadows, the subtle distortions, all were invitations, warnings, or perhaps tests. One wrong move and it would claim more than his attention, and yet he could not tear himself away. Days bled into nights, but Vladimir could no longer distinguish one from the other. Sleep had become a frail, fleeting reprieve, a thin veil between the real world and the one waiting behind the walls. Every time he closed his eyes, the whispers returned, sometimes distant, sometimes impossibly close, and always insistent. "Vladimir!" He started hearing something new, footsteps. Not in the hallway, not in the rooms, but inside the walls. A subtle, skittering shuffle, like someone pacing deliberately, testing the limits of the wood and plaster. At first he told himself it was rats, the house settling, old pipes contracting. But rats do not call your name. Rats do not pause in rhythm with your own heartbeat. One evening, exhausted and tense beyond reason, he sat in the living room listening. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows long and still. Then came the faintest tap-tap-tap, a slow, deliberate cadence moving along the wall toward the hallway. Vladimir froze, ears straining. The footsteps stopped outside his parents' room. The rattling of the door followed, slow like a drumbeat. "Vladimir!" He swallowed hard. His hands shook. The knife lay useless on the table. He wanted to scream, to call for his mother, but the presence seemed to recoil from witnesses. Only he could hear it. Only he could see it. Days became nights. Nights became a perpetual state of alert. Every sound and the floorboards, the dripping water, the wind against the windows, became a cipher, a potential signal. The whispers multiplied. Sometimes they overlapped, layering, repeating, as though more than one voice now spoke from the darkness. And sometimes he swore he heard a voice that wasn't his father's, colder, sharper, ancient, reminding him of the night of the stroke. He tried to confront it. He opened the door fully, knife ready, flashlight trembling in his grip. The room was empty. The shadows retreated into corners. Yet when he turned to leave, he felt it, the pull again. The house seemed to breathe around him, walls stretching, shadows twitching. At that moment, he understood. The presence was tethered not to the house, not fully to his father, but to that night. The night his father had fallen. The night the snowstorm trapped them. The night the whispers had first spoken his name. He was both witness and lure, and then, as if confirming his worst suspicion, the footsteps resumed faster this time, circling the hallway, following him. They never crossed the living room threshold, but always remained just behind him. Always just beyond reach, he could no longer stay. He fled outside into the cold, biting air of dawn. Snow had returned in soft flakes, deceptively calm after the storm that had trapped them 10 months prior. He thought the presence would stop outside, that daylight would weaken it. But as he stepped onto the porch, he heard the faintest rattle of the door behind him, as if mocking his attempt at escape. "Vladimir!" The sound drifted with the wind, impossibly soft, yet undeniably there. He realized then that it was patient. It would wait. 10 minutes, 10 hours, 10 months, 10 years, it didn't matter. It had tethered itself to him, and like the snow outside, it would never truly disappear. And Vladimir understood with cold certainty that the house was no longer a home. It was a doorway. Sleep was no longer a refuge. Even the briefest closure of his eyes summoned shadows, whispers, and the low, insistent rattling of doors that seemed alive. Vladimir's world had narrowed to the house, the hallway, the doors, and increasingly the mirrors. It began subtly. The first time he caught movement in the reflection of the living room window. He had been standing still, looking down at the floor, yet the reflection showed him turning his head toward the hallway, toward the door that had claimed his attention since that stormy night. He blinked. Nothing. The reflection matched his actual stance. The window was just glass, or so he told himself, but the pattern persisted. Every reflective surface, the bathroom mirror, the kitchen window, even the polished frame of a picture on the wall, began to show what wasn't there. Shadows stretching behind him, silhouettes crouched in corners, movements that his eyes could not detect directly, and sometimes, fleetingly, glimpses of a face that was not his father, not his own, not human, but staring directly at him through the glass. One night, driven by equal parts fear and fascination, Vladimir stood before the full-length mirror in the hallway outside his parents' room. The door rattled faintly behind him, the same measured, almost ceremonial pattern that had haunted him for weeks. The shadows stretched in the reflection far longer than in reality, curling around the corners of the room, and then he saw it. A hand pressed against the inside of the mirror, a hand pale and distorted, fingers impossibly long. It mirrored his movements, but with a delay, a subtle hesitation, as if the thing behind the glass was learning, adapting. "Vladimir!" The whisper came again, low and insistent, emanating not from the door this time, but from the very surface of the mirror. The figure behind the glass seemed to pulse with life, each movement deliberate, and it wasn't his reflection anymore. It was something else, tethered to him, to the night of the stroke, to the snowstorm, to the door. He reached toward it, hand trembling. The moment his fingers touched the glass, a cold, wet shock crawled up his arm. The figure recoiled, slipping into shadow, leaving only a vague outline before vanishing entirely. His reflection returned, normal and inert, yet he knew it hadn't truly disappeared. It lingered, waiting in the surfaces of the home, in windows, mirrors, even the faint sheen of water on the kitchen floor. The house itself had become a labyrinth of reflections, and each one might harbor the presence, patient and deliberate, watching him, testing him. Vladimir tried to avoid mirrors entirely, but that was impossible. Their existence was inescapable. Even in his father's room, where he came to check on him, the light from the window caught the edge of a glass frame, revealing for a split second a shadow leaning close to him, an impossible angle, a distortion of reality itself. Sleep continued to evade him. The whispers grew more articulate, almost conversational now, though always trailing into static-like distortion. "Vladimir, you can see me. You know me." And he did. He knew this presence intimately, though he had never seen it directly. It was tied to his fear, his guilt, his memory of the night his father fell. It was patient. It was eternal. And it was learning. That night, as he finally sank into a shallow, trembling rest on the living room couch, he dreamt of the door, of shadows curling from walls into mirrors, of whispers that carried through every corner of the house. He awoke with the image of the figure pressed against the glass burned into his mind, and the terrifying realization that the house was no longer just a place. It was a conduit, and he was the conduit's prey. Vladimir's nights had become indistinguishable from his days. Sleep was a fleeting, dangerous state, where shadows slipped closer and whispers carved themselves into his mind. The house pulsed with life, or something like it, and every door, every mirror, every wall became a conduit for the presence. It began subtly at first, fleeting sensations, as if the hallway outside his parents' room stretched longer than it should. A misstep would send him stumbling against a wall that wasn't there moments before. Footsteps echoed behind him, just out of sync with his own, and sometimes, only sometimes, a whisper threaded through the static of his thoughts. "Vladimir, remember." Then came the echoes. First, small ones, the faint sound of shoveling outside, though the snow had long since melted. The distant drip of water, but rhythmic, like the taps of a foot dragging along the floor. And then the door, the one his father had rattled that night, began to mimic the sounds of struggle, faint moans and desperate whispers. Vladimir froze, his heart hammering. He knew what the house was doing. It was replaying that night, not as memory, but as performance. A distortion of time stitched into shadows and whispers, where reality and recollection intertwined until he could no longer tell one from the other. The rattling grew louder. Then the whispers, fragmented, overlapping, and now more coherent. "Vladimir, help! I can't move!" His father's voice, clear, anguished, slicing through the static of the distorted echoes. Vladimir ran down the hallway, knife in hand, reaching for the door. But the room was empty, no one. Yet the echoes persisted. The sound of a body hitting the floor, the scuff of slippers, the rasp of breath struggling to call out. Shadows stretched along the walls, crawling like ink across plaster. They moved in tandem with the echoes, reinforcing them, distorting them. For a moment, Vladimir felt as if the house itself had swallowed that night whole and was replaying it just for him, a theater of trauma, where he was both observer and participant. The mirrors now reflected the echoes too. He glimpsed fleeting images of his father on the floor, reaching out, half-shrouded in darkness, distorted by the glass. But when he turned, the room was normal, still innocuous. The past and present collided, each reinforcing the other, and the presence laughed. Faintly through the rattling, the whispers, the shifting shadows, Vladimir realized with cold dread that the house wasn't replaying a memory. It was testing him, measuring his reactions, learning what terrified him, how he moved, how he breathed, how he hesitated. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every hesitation became part of the performance. And the house, or whatever lived in it, would not relent. He sank to the floor, trembling. The echoes of the fall, the night of the stroke, the snowstorm, his father's whispered pleas, all intertwined with the shadows and the whispers, pressed down upon him. And in the distance he heard it again, clear as the first night. Vladimir, Kami. The past had become a living entity, a tether to the present, and he knew with terrible clarity he could never leave it behind. Vladimir had begun to notice the watching. Not the vague impressions of shadows or whispers, but a tangible awareness, almost sentient, threading through the house. It was patient, deliberate, intelligent, as if the very darkness was alive and studying him. It started with the feeling of being observed. At first he brushed it off. Paranoia, the residual trauma from the stroke night. Stress, exhaustion. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Every time he moved through a hallway, every time he glanced into a darkened room, the sensation was there, eyes. Unseen yet palpably present, following him, tracking him, even in the living room. With lights blazing and the TV humming, he felt it. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners. Reflections walked subtly, showing not just himself but something else. Something crouched just beyond perception, eyes glinting faintly in the gloom. The whispering intensified. This time not from the mirrors or the door, but the very air. "Vladimir, I see you." He froze. The voice had weight, menace, and certainty. He wanted to run, but the house itself seemed to resist him. Floorboards groaned under his feet. Though he hadn't stepped, walls shifted subtly, narrowing the hallways, bending angles he knew intimately. Every glance toward a doorway, a window or a mirror revealed movement, fleeting, uncanny, a shadow sliding just out of focus. One night, he thought he saw two glowing points of light behind the living room couch, like eyes floating in mid-air. He blinked. They vanished. Yet the feeling remained, heavy and unrelenting. Even his father's room wasn't safe. The door rattled softly at night, then paused, then rasped again. Vladimir would peer inside, expecting to see someone, anything, but it was empty. Yet the room felt alive. He could sense presence, shape, intention, something waiting, always waiting. Sleep became impossible. His dreams were invaded by the same watching. Shadows slithering across walls, eyes reflecting nothing but darkness. Whispers threading into his thoughts. "Vladimir, come, follow, join." He tried to resist. He tried to barricade himself, to avoid the hallways and mirrors, to shut out the presence. But it was everywhere, patient, intelligent, knowing where he would go before he moved. One evening, while checking on his father, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Two points of light glimmered just beyond the bed, eyes fixed on him. He spun toward them, nothing. The air was cold, stagnant, heavy with something unnameable. "Vladimir!" He collapsed against the wall, knife useless in hand. The house, the door, the shadows, the whispers, they all existed with purpose now. No longer passive, no longer subtle. They were observing, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. And Vladimir understood with a shiver that ran to the marrow. He was not merely haunted, he was being hunted. Vladimir had reached a breaking point. Days and nights blurred, shadows and whispers consuming every fragment of his consciousness. The house, no longer just a place, was an entity, patient, deliberate, intelligent. It had been watching, learning, shaping the environment, and now it was ready to act. The door, the one his father had rattled that night, began to pulse subtly, as if breathing. Shadows pooled around its frame, curling unnaturally, spreading like ink across the hallway. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, layering over each other, almost chanting, "Vladimir, come, step, enter." He tried to resist, tried to ignore it, but the air thickened. The walls seemed to bow toward him, closing off escape. Even the mirrors, which had once offered glimpses, now reflected only darkness. No light, no reality, just black, infinite and hungry. A single thought consumed him, the threshold. He understood with bone-deep clarity that the entity sought to draw him across it, from the world of flesh and reason into the shadowed, distorted plane it inhabited. The air near the door shimmered, warped, vibrating subtly as if reality itself had thinned. Vladimir's pulse pounded. His knife, once a comfort, felt absurdly small. The shadows whispered, pressing against him, tugging at the corners of his mind. He thought of his father, lying paralyzed but alive, and felt a surge of desperate courage. He would not leave him. He would not step into the darkness. The entity tested him. Shadows lengthened, flickering along walls, doors, mirrors. The floorboards shifted beneath him, and the whispers became voices overlapping, impossible to pass. "Vladimir, join us." The night, the fall. The door? He approached the door. Not to cross it, but to confront it. Knife in hand, he steadied himself, heart hammering, breath ragged. The rattling grew frantic, desperate, then ceased. Silence. Absolute. He placed a hand on the door. The air shifted. He could feel something on the other side. Patient, aware, like a predator smelling fear. And then, in a voice that was neither human nor fully audible, it spoke directly into his mind. "Step through and you will not return." "Stay and we will wait." He recoiled, staggering backward. The presence did not pursue. It waited, patient, eternal. The threshold remained, and a promise and a threat, a boundary between his world and whatever it inhabited. Vladimir understood something chilling. The entity could not enter fully unless he crossed the line. It could manipulate, torment, observe, but the boundary of the door of the house of his own will was what restrained it. And yet, the knowledge brought no comfort. It was a test, a game, a predator gauging his fear and resolve. And Vladimir knew as he stood trembling in the hallway that this was far from over. The threshold had been revealed. The entity had shown its patience and intelligence, and he, the tether, the observer, the preyed, was already ensnared. Vladimir stood in the hallway trembling, knife in hand, staring at the door that had become both a boundary and a conduit. The whispers had faded to faint echoes, the shadows pooling along the walls like ink in water. The house was silent, but the silence was heavy, oppressive, charged with an intelligence he could not see yet could feel. He thought of his father, paralyzed but alive, his voice full of gratitude and exhaustion, still tethered to reality in a way the entity could not touch. That tether had given Vladimir strength. He realized then that he was the guardian, in some sense the barrier between the presence and the rest of the world. The door rattled softly once more, a subtle pulse that reminded him the watcher remained. But he did not step forward. He did not yield. He breathed deeply, summoning every ounce of willpower to remain anchored to his world, to his family, to life itself. The mirrors reflected only him. No distorted faces, no crouched shadows. The hallway stretched normally, walls straight and familiar. And yet he knew better. He knew the presence waited, patient, unseen, intelligent. It had learned, adapted, and it would wait as long as necessary. Vladimir backed away from the door, closing it slowly. Every instinct screamed that he had survived, that the immediate danger was over. But in the corners of his vision, in the faint hum of the house itself, he could feel the presence's awareness. It was patient, eternal, watching. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a small exhale. He returned to his father's room, checking on him, grateful beyond words that the man he had once considered his hero had survived the stroke. He knew the path ahead would be hard. Recovery, therapy, adaptation. But in that room, the darkness felt less immediate. The entity had not claimed him, and yet Vladimir understood with cold certainty it had not left. It never would. The watcher remained, tethered to the house, to the door, to him, patient, waiting for the moment it could strike, for the moment he faltered, for the moment the threshold thinned. He turned on the lights, locked the door, and lay awake that night, listening to the faint creaks of the house. The whispers were gone for now, but in the marrow of his bones he knew they would return, and when they did, the shadows would move again, the door would rattle, and the watcher would remain. Vladimir was alive. His father was alive. But the house and the presence that had lingered unseen had changed everything. The terror of that snowstorm night, of the stroke, of the rattling door had left a permanent mark, and the watcher remained. The house that watched. From the moment they first stepped into the house, it never felt like home. The floors creaked underfoot with a tired, hollow groan, the kind that made someone pause mid-step. The walls seemed too close, the ceilings too low, and the shadows that gathered in the corners were sharp and accusing, not soft and welcoming. Every room felt like it had a memory of its own, a past that lingered just out of sight, humming faintly behind the wallpaper. She had known something was off the instant they signed the lease. The real estate agent's cheery words felt like a hollow mask. The house had a gravity that pressed against her chest. She mentioned it to her boyfriend once, laughing nervously. "You're just letting your imagination run wild," he'd said, brushing her concern aside. Their roommate shrugged, similarly indifferent. But she couldn't shake it. Every time she walked inside alone, she felt it. Eyes on her, watching, judging, waiting. Her boyfriend and roommate both worked night shifts, leaving her alone during the long stretches of darkness when the world outside was silent and the house itself became louder, its creaks and groans amplified by the empty rooms. It was a Tuesday night, she remembered. Nothing special, just another night alone with the TV for company. The soft glow of the screen painted the living room in shifting blues and grays, and for a while she felt safe. But then the feeling returned. That gnawing, creeping awareness that she was being watched. It wasn't sudden, not like a jump scare. It was slow, cumulative, like a cold finger tracing her spine. She ignored it at first, convincing herself that it was nerves. But the sensation persisted, crawling under her skin, growing in intensity. When she looked toward the hallway that led to her bedroom, a shiver passed through her. The hall stretched unnaturally in the dim light, the darkness at its far end seeming to thicken, waiting. Hours passed, and the feeling intensified. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of the wind outside, every subtle draft from a poorly sealed window became a signal. She avoided the hallway entirely, circling around the house in smaller paths, taking longer routes just to stay out of sight of its darkened length. And then it happened. The sound of a drawer being pulled open, slow, deliberate, scraping against the stopper at the back. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. The living room light flickered softly, the glow catching nothing unusual. She stood, eyes darting to the cabinet. Empty. Nothing moved. Seconds later, the drawer hit the stopper again, the sound echoing in the small, oppressive silence of the room. She stepped closer, trembling, and the light illuminated everything, but nothing was out of place. The sound came again and again, 6 times in total. Each strike felt more deliberate, more aggressive, as though the house itself were tapping at her sanity. By the time she curled up in bed with the light on, she was shaking. Every nerve in her body screamed to leave, to flee, but the night pressed down on her. She waited, stiff and alert, counting the minutes until her boyfriend returned from work. When he rolled in at 3 a.m., laughing at her terror, she felt a fleeting relief until he turned off the light. That was when everything escalated. Doors down the hallway slammed shut one by one with the force of a storm. The closet doors rattled violently. She could hear the shelves inside tumbling, poles striking the walls, every object within being tossed around. Though the room appeared untouched when they finally dared to look, they hid under the covers together, hearts pounding, unsure if the house was testing them, punishing them, or something else entirely. Hours later, when they finally dared to inspect the house, nothing had moved. The roommate had been away for the night, confirming they were alone. The light remained on, an artificial shield against the unseen. And even after they moved out, she couldn't pass by the house without a shiver. It had imprinted itself into her memory, a living, breathing presence that seemed to linger in the shadows, always watching. The house seemed quieter in daylight, but only barely. Even when the sun filtered through the blinds, it did little to lift the oppressive weight that hung over the rooms. Shadows lingered longer than they should, curling along walls and corners, hesitant to retreat. It was in these moments, when the world felt calm, that the house reminded her she was never truly alone. That night she decided to follow her usual routine. The TV hummed in the background, low and comforting, while she sat cross-legged on the couch, absent-mindedly scrolling through her phone. Every sound, the faucet dripping, the faint groan of the walls, the hum of the refrigerator, made her flinch. She kept glancing toward the hallway, trying to convince herself that it was just anxiety, nothing more. But her instincts screamed otherwise. Something about that hallway felt wrong. It seemed alive, shifting imperceptibly each time she looked away, bending the angle of the walls subtly, swallowing the light from the living room, stretching the shadows at the far end. Her pulse quickened with each step closer. It started small. A drawer in the kitchen cabinet pulled itself open with a soft scrape against the stopper. She froze mid-breath, the hairs on her arms standing. Nothing moved visibly, yet the sound repeated, slow and deliberate. 6 times it happened in total, each one sharper than the last, echoing like deliberate taps, a signal or a warning she couldn't interpret. By the time she dared to make her way to the hallway, she had left the overhead lights on and kept her bedside lamp lit. Each footstep felt heavier, deliberate, as though the house itself were calculating the exact moment she would pass into the darkened corridor. The hallway stretched in the dim light like a tunnel, walls bending slightly in ways she couldn't rationalize. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but she pressed forward. The temperature shifted suddenly, colder, a breath of icy air brushing her neck. She spun around, but the living room remained still, normal, untouched. Yet the hallway seemed to respond to her presence, as if the darkness were alive and aware. She reached her bedroom door and felt a momentary relief. The light from her lamp painted her familiar belongings in warm tones, but the relief was fleeting. She remembered the drawer. The sound returned, faint at first, then deliberate, moving closer. She could no longer tell if it was coming from the kitchen or somewhere in the hallway. The house had become unpredictable, almost sentient. When her boyfriend finally returned, he laughed at her nerves, dismissing the tension she felt as overreaction. But she had learned better. As soon as he turned off the lights, the house erupted into chaos. Doors slammed shut one after another, rattling like a hurricane confined to wooden frames. The closet doors rattled violently, shelves shaking, poles banging against walls, all while no object appeared out of place. They both huddled under the covers, hearts pounding, listening to the violent chorus. Each crash and slam was precise, deliberate, as though the house were performing a malicious symphony. No explanation fit. Their roommate was away 3 hours from the house, leaving only the two of them, helpless and terrified. By morning, the house returned to its quiet, deceptive calm. Yet the fear remained, etched in their memories. The hallway had become more than a passage. It had become a gauntlet, a test. Even with lights on, the shadows remained, lurking in corners, waiting for moments of vulnerability. And she understood one undeniable truth. The house had its own will, and the hallway was its domain. Darkness alone was enough to awaken it. The hallway had become a battlefield of fear. Every step along its length felt like walking into a predator's gaze, though no eyes could be seen. Yet she knew she was being watched. Every nerve in her body screamed it, and the shadows themselves seemed to move with deliberate awareness, curling along the walls to track her. It started with glimpses in the corner of her vision. Something darker than the shadows, denser, more deliberate, shifted when she moved. A subtle sway, a flicker that wasn't caused by the light or her imagination. Each glance toward the hallway intensified the sensation. Eyes, unseen, following her. One night, curled up under the covers with the bedroom light on, she thought she saw them, two faint glimmers near the far end of the hall. She blinked, heart hammering, and the glimmers vanished, leaving only the familiar darkness. Yet the feeling persisted. She could feel a gaze resting on her, calculating, waiting. Even her boyfriend noticed it when he came home. Laughing, he had dismissed her fear repeatedly. But as they stood together in the hallway, the shadows shifted unnaturally in his presence too. Doors, once quiet, seemed to lean toward them, rattling softly, a subtle insistence of observation. The closet, now silent for the moment, appeared to breathe, waiting. The house had become intelligent, not in the human sense, but aware, responding to movement, learning patterns, gauging fear. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light was a signal. And the hallway was the stage. She began avoiding it entirely when alone, circling around rooms, refusing to meet its gaze. Yet the presence adapted. Lights flickered, objects moved slightly in her peripheral vision, and the air grew heavier whenever she lingered too long. The house was alive, and she was its study. The glimmers returned, faint points of light that lingered at the edges of perception. Sometimes two, sometimes more, always just beyond the limits of sight. They didn't move randomly. They tracked her movements, converging, retreating, circling. She felt them in her chest, a cold awareness pressing down, weighing her thoughts, stretching her nerves thin. It became impossible to sleep without light. The hallway, once a simple passage, was now a conduit of fear, a channel through which the house observed her relentlessly. Even when awake, she felt the eyes, the sentience of the shadows, the calculating presence that understood her patterns, her weaknesses, her instinct to flee, and she realized, with a sinking certainty, that the house wasn't just haunted, it was sentient, patient. It waited for mistakes, for hesitation, for moments when fear overcame reason. The hallway had become its domain, and she was trapped inside it. It began as a low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable to her trained ears. The house was speaking, in its own language of wood and metal, testing boundaries and measuring fear. She had grown accustomed to rattles and knocks, to flickers of shadow, but this was different, intentional, angry, violent. That night she stayed in the living room, the lamp casting a warm circle of light around her. She tried to distract herself with TV, scrolling through her phone, but the sensation of being observed was heavier than ever. Then came the first movement. A glass on the coffee table slid across the surface on its own. Not tipped over, not careless. It moved deliberately, inch by inch, until it stopped just at the edge of the lamp's glow. She froze, breath shallow, staring. It had been subtle, precise, a warning or a test. Then another. The books on the shelf rattled violently, tipping and shifting in ways that should have toppled them, but didn't. Their covers scratched against each other, producing a sharp staccato sound that echoed down the hallway. Her pulse pounded. The hallway light flickered and went out. The darkness seemed to pulse alive, responding to her fear. The closet doors rattled once, twice, and then exploded into a frenzy. Shelves banged against the walls, hangers clanged, and the sound of something being thrown around inside filled the air. Yet when she finally gathered the courage to look, the closet was untouched. Her boyfriend woke at the commotion, laughing at first, but the intensity of the sounds silenced him. They clung to each other under the covers, hearts hammering, listening to the house's symphony of destruction. Each object moved with deliberate intent, a language she couldn't understand. Yet the meaning was clear. They were intruders, and the house demanded respect. The night stretched endlessly. The air grew colder, heavier, charged with an invisible electricity. Objects moved again. Books, cups, drawers, even a small chair sliding across the floor toward her. It was as though the house could reach out, probe, threaten, without ever leaving its walls. She realized with a shiver that this wasn't random. The house was learning. Each reaction, each flinch, each moment of frozen terror was noted, remembered, and adapted to. Darkness was its ally, fear its language. By dawn, the house fell silent, leaving only the faint echoes of violence and the memory of its calculated fury. Every floorboard, every shadow, every object seemed to hum with the energy of what had just passed. A warning that the house would not tolerate intrusion, that it was aware, patient, and infinitely intelligent. Even with daylight, the residual tension lingered. Every glance toward the hallway, every shadow in a corner felt charged with intent. The house was no longer just a location. It was a predator, and they were its prey. Even the small victories of daylight could not banish the house's presence. Shadows lurked where light failed to reach, stretching unnaturally along walls and floors. Lamps flickered despite functioning bulbs. Reflections in windows and mirrors seemed subtly delayed, lagging behind her movements, as if the house itself were observing. Learning, cataloging, that night, she left the hallway light on again, determined to shield herself. But the house's patience had deepened, and so had its strategy. The darkness returned in pockets, growing like ink spreading across the edges of light, pushing her perception until she questioned the integrity of the lamps themselves. The closet doors rattled once more, then twice. Shelves creaked, hangers clanged, and a drawer in the hallway banged sharply against its stopper, as if punctuating a sentence she could not understand. Each sound was precise, deliberate, a message composed of destruction. The shadows began to move with intent. One moment the hallway seemed empty, normal. The next, shadows pooled and shifted, forming shapes that suggested motion just beyond the edge of vision. She blinked, heart pounding, and the shapes coalesced for a brief instant. Two glowing points where she knew the eyes of a predator would be. She spun around, finding nothing. But the sensation persisted. Something was watching, waiting, responding to her every decision. Her boyfriend attempted to reassure her, joking at first, but when the closet erupted into violent rattling again, even he was silent. The energy in the house felt thick, almost tangible. It pressed against them, bending the ordinary contours of the rooms, warping reality in subtle ways. She tried to focus on rational explanations, wind drafts, old wood, settling floors. But logic faltered when the shadows formed shapes that mirrored their movements, anticipating steps, blocking paths, responding to fear with precision. Every room became a gauntlet. Even in the living room, the faint edges of darkness seemed to shift toward her, gathering at the corners, stretching along the ceiling. The hallway was no longer a mere passage. It was a stage for observation, a trap for hesitation. The night stretched endlessly. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light, every subtle movement was a calculated attempt to unbalance her, to test her resolve. She began to understand. The house did not need to touch her to terrify her. It could manipulate perception, bending reality to its will, isolating her with fear and shadows. By dawn, the light from outside revealed nothing unusual. The house appeared calm, obedient even, but the memory of the night's terror lingered, pressing into her mind, reminding her that the house's patience was infinite, its intelligence deliberate, and its focus unwavering. She realized with cold certainty that she was never alone, even in the perceived safety of light. Darkness had returned, patient and aware, waiting for the next opportunity to exploit her fear. The nights became unbearable. The house was no longer content with mere rattles and flashes of shadow. It had begun to communicate. Soft whispers floated along the hallway, just at the edge of hearing, indistinct and fleeting, impossible to localize. Sometimes it was like a syllable or a name, but always indistinct, leaving the mind to fill in the terrifying gaps. She curled under the covers, listening intently. The whispers were patient, teasing, deliberate. The words never fully formed. Instead, they suggested something larger, something that existed beyond perception. They lingered, fading in and out with unnatural rhythm, punctuated by the occasional crash or thud that made her flinch. Objects continued to move subtly. A cup on the counter shifted slightly when she wasn't looking. Books leaned in impossible angles. Drawers rattled softly as if breathing. Nothing fell or broke, yet the movement carried intent, a precision that hinted at awareness. The house was not chaotic. It was deliberate. Her boyfriend laughed nervously when she recounted the events, brushing it off as nerves. But that night, even he could hear it. A soft thump behind the closet door, the slow drag of a chair across the floor, a whisper just at the edge of comprehension. The house was aware of them both, learning, calculating, testing limits. She began noticing patterns. The sounds escalated when she lingered in a room too long. Movements seemed to respond to her gaze. Objects avoided her eyes but shifted when unobserved. It was testing her, measuring her reactions, gauging her fear. One night the whispers became almost articulate. Percy Vladimir. She thought she heard but knew it was impossible. Her boyfriend's name wasn't even being used. And yet the intensity of the sound pressed against her mind, drawing her attention to the hallway, toward the darkness she had avoided for weeks. The closet erupted again, though this time subtly. Shelves shifted, hangers scraped together, yet nothing fell. The sound was loud enough to echo, precise enough to demand attention. She flinched back into the bed, holding her breath, while the whispers continued. Patient, teasing, almost sentient. The house had evolved. It wasn't just a location anymore. It was a sentient predator, using shadows, whispers, and movement to manipulate, terrify, and isolate. She realized she was being studied, tested. Every heartbeat, every twitch, every glance at the hallway became data for it to exploit. By morning, the whispers faded, the objects remained in place, and the house returned to its deceptive calm. But she knew with deep certainty that it would resume patient and intelligent the moment fear returned. By now, the hallway had become more than a passage. It was a living entity, waiting, watching, stalking. Every time she approached it, she could feel its awareness pressing against her. Shadows pooled unnaturally along its length, stretching, curling, as if anticipating her steps. Even with the lights on, the sensation didn't fade. The house seemed to respond to her choices. If she hesitated, the shadows thickened. If she moved quickly, the floorboards groaned under invisible weight, almost as if the hallway itself were adjusting its pace to match hers. Doors rattled softly as she passed, subtle and deliberate, and the closet seemed to lean toward her, waiting for her to look directly. She stopped at its threshold, heart hammering, and the air grew cold, pressing in from the walls and ceiling. It wasn't just observation anymore. The hallway followed her, in a sense that defied reason. She could feel it in her spine, a cold weight tracking her movements. She would glance back and think the end of the hall looked normal, but then shadows would shift ever so slightly, suggesting presence. A shape there one moment, gone the next, but always just outside direct sight. Her boyfriend began to notice too. Laughing at first had turned to silent unease. He didn't argue anymore when she avoided the hallway, when she refused to check the closet, when she circled the house instead of walking straight to her bedroom. They both understood. The hallway was alive, intelligent, and aware of their fear. One night the hallway escalated. As she stepped toward her bedroom, all the doors along the corridor slammed shut one by one. The sound echoed violently yet precisely. Not chaotic but deliberate, timed to startle and dominate,